the crowded Briarwick Central Station, a young black medical student was on his way to a crucial scholarship interview. Suddenly, an elderly white man in a wheelchair got stuck on the tracks as a train barreled toward him. No one moved. Without hesitation, the student jumped down and saved him just in time. What he didn't know was that the man he rescued was a retired military doctor, and that single act of courage would open a door that changed his life forever. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. Briarwick Central Station was alive with movement but dead in spirit. It was just past 8 o'clock in the morning, the kind of fall morning when the air clung to your skin, damp and sharp, not yet winter but no longer warm. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale yellow shadows on cracked white tiles. Footsteps echoed on concrete. Announcements blared overhead. Robotic and ignored, the smell of hot pretzels, old rainwater, and something faintly metallic hung in the air. The platform was crowded but strangely quiet, like a waiting room where no one made eye contact. Dozens of commuters lined the edge. Suited professionals, delivery workers in orange vests, teenagers with oversized headphones, and tourists gripping maps like lifelines. Everyone focused on their own little world. Earbuds in, eyes down, phones glowing in palms like lifeboats in a sea of concrete. Among them stood Darius Knight, 25, black, about 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and calm, observant eyes. He wore a navy peacoat that had lost its crispness at the cuffs, dark jeans, and white sneakers dulled by city grit. His close-cropped hair faded cleanly at the sides, and his jaw was square, marked by a faint scar near his left cheek, barely visible unless you were close. Underneath the coat, a stethoscope stuck out slightly from the side pocket of his backpack. Darius had been up since 5, coming off an overnight shift at the ER in Cook County Regional Hospital. No sleep, just cold coffee and a granola bar he'd eaten on the train ride downtown. He was headed to the Lakeshore District for a scholarship interview, the Equitas Health Fellowship, one of the few programs that actually looked beyond test scores and legacy names. It was a long shot, but it mattered. He stood near the edge of the platform, one hand gripping the strap of his backpack, the other in his coat pocket rubbing the corner of an old church bulletin his mother had tucked into his coat the day before. "Walk in purpose, not pride," she'd said. That was her way of praying without making a scene. Across from him on the opposite platform, a movement broke the morning's monotony. An elderly white man in a motorized wheelchair was inching forward, trying to navigate closer to the edge. He looked like he was in his 80s, thin frame, wisps of silver hair, and a beige trench coat folded neatly over his lap. The wheels turned slightly and then caught. The front left wheel dipped forward just enough to get stuck between the concrete platform and the steel rail. It wasn't dramatic. No one screamed, just a small metal-on-metal crunch. Darius noticed immediately. He stepped forward, narrowing his eyes. The man rocked the chair backward, but it didn't move. His hands shook. His shoulders hunched. One passerby glanced his way and then looked back at his phone. Another woman in workout clothes pulled her daughter gently aside as if not wanting to get involved. Darius's chest tightened. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. He looked around. Still no one moved. A man in a gray coat stood 10 feet away from the wheelchair sipping coffee. He saw it but did nothing. A teenager pulled out his phone and started recording. No one moved. Then came the sound. A low rumble, distant but unmistakable. The train was coming. Darius's pulse jumped. He stepped forward again, then stopped himself. His mind started racing. The access ladder, where was it? Could he reach the man in time? Across the track, the old man now looked up. He realized what was happening. His hands gripped the armrests. His mouth opened slightly, but he didn't speak. His legs didn't move. Darius could tell it was a spinal injury. Maybe he wasn't getting out of that chair on his own. And still nobody moved. Someone near Darius whispered, "Is this real?" Another person pulled out their phone. The rumble was louder now. The vibration traveled through the soles of Darius's shoes. He could feel it. That's when it happened. He dropped his backpack. The stethoscope clattered softly on the concrete, and Darius ran. Darius ran. Not the kind of run you do to catch a train, but the kind where every muscle in your body tightens with instinct, where your brain stops debating and your body just moves. He sprinted down the platform, dodging stiff, frozen strangers who still hadn't decided whether they should help or just keep filming. His coat flew off mid-run, abandoned like a weight he didn't have time for. His eyes locked on a narrow access ladder halfway down the platform. A rusted thing with chipped yellow paint and a danger sign no one had read in years. He reached it and didn't hesitate. One boot hit the top rung. The other followed. Then gravity took over. The ladder shook under his weight. Metal scraped against metal. Halfway down, his boot slipped. For one breathless second, he nearly fell but caught himself. No time to think about it. His shoes slammed onto the gravel-covered track bed. It smelled like oil and steel and 10 years of filth. The walls felt closer down there, the tunnel darker, heavier. He turned toward the wheelchair and froze. The old man, his head shaking, lips trembling, was now angled downward with the front wheels fully off the edge. His hands clawed at the rims of the rear wheels, trying to gain traction, trying to back up. But he wasn't going anywhere, and the fear in his eyes had turned to terror. Darius heard the rumble. Deep, violent, closer. He didn't even look toward the tunnel. He could feel it now, like the bones in his legs were humming with it. He crossed the tracks in long strides, gravel crunching underfoot, his breath short and shallow. He crouched at the front of the wheelchair and grabbed the frame. Cold steel, no leverage. He yanked, nothing. The front wheels were wedged between the track and the platform lip like they'd been designed to get stuck. He shifted his stance, planting both feet wide, and pulled harder. Fingers straining, arms burning. Still no movement. Behind him, up on the platform, someone screamed. "He's not going to make it." Darius gritted his teeth and yelled, "I need help down here." Silence. The train's headlights broke the tunnel bend. 2 white circles flickering through the dust, coming fast. Then footsteps, a thud. Someone was coming down the ladder. A woman's voice sharp, commanding, "Don't let go. I'm here." She dropped beside him, barefoot, her blazer still on but sweat already forming on her brow. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask questions. She crouched beside the old man and wrapped both arms around his chest, anchoring him. Darius shifted to the side of the chair. "On my count," he barked. 1, 2, lift. They pulled together. The chair groaned. Metal scraped against concrete. One wheel popped loose, then the other, but they weren't safe yet. The platform was only a few feet away, but the tracks were uneven, and the train was seconds out. Darius grabbed the back handles and pushed with everything he had. His legs slipped in the gravel. His palms tore on the rusted frame, but the chair inched forward. "Come on!" The woman shouted, half lifting the front. They reached the edge. Darius dug in, bent low, and heaved the chair upward. He didn't make it. He lost grip on one side. The chair tilted back. The woman screamed. The old man's arm flailed. The train horn blared, deafening, final. Darius snarled and lunged forward, grabbing the front wheel with both hands. His shoulders screamed in pain. He twisted, threw his weight back, and yanked the chair up onto the platform just as the front of the train exploded out of the tunnel, lights blazing like fire. The wheels cleared the edge. Darius threw himself sideways into the wall of the platform pit as the train roared past, the wind slamming into him like a slap. It was so close he felt the heat on his skin. He stayed crouched for a second, his chest rising in ragged gulps, ears ringing from the horn and the roar and the pounding of blood in his skull. He was alive barely. He looked up. The woman was on the platform, pulling the chair fully back with one final grunt. The old man was gasping, hands trembling on the armrests, eyes staring straight ahead in pure shock. Darius stumbled to his feet and reached up. She extended her hand. Her grip was strong, urgent. She helped haul him up. For a second, no one spoke. Then clapping scattered, awkward, as if the crowd had just remembered they were human. Phones were still recording. A teenage girl whispered, "Did you see that? He really did that. Darius didn't answer anyone. He didn't speak to the crowd. He didn't check the camera lenses now pointing his way. He turned to the old man, crouched slightly, looked him in the eye, and asked, "Are you hurt?" The man's voice was barely there. "No, I think I'm okay." Darius nodded, his face blank, his body still buzzing with adrenaline. He walked past the crowd, past the platforms, peeling pillars, past the people parting for him like he carried a fire. No one tried to stop him. His coat lay where he left it. He picked it up without a word and slipped his arm back through the sleeve. His shirt underneath was soaked through. His knuckles were red. His knees ached. His chest felt heavy. He looked at the station clock. The interview was in less than 10 minutes. He had no chance of making it. But as he climbed the stairs 2 steps at a time, he didn't feel regret. The train had passed. The man was alive. And Darius hadn't waited for someone else to do the right thing. He hadn't waited at all. Darius didn't check his phone until hours later. After leaving the station, he'd wandered through the city in a haze. Too wired to rest but too drained to do anything useful. He'd missed the interview, of course. No amount of explanation could fix that. And truth be told, he hadn't even tried to call. His mind had been elsewhere, playing the moment over and over again in his head. The grip of the wheelchair handles, the sound of the approaching train, the woman's voice shouting, "Lift," the burning in his legs when he shoved the man to safety. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the horn. When he finally took a seat on a park bench near Havencrest Medical Park and opened his phone, the screen lit up like a flare. 42 missed calls, 17 text messages, and dozens of notifications from people he didn't know. He blinked, opened one text. "Bro, you're on the news. Like, WBC News 7 just showed the video." Another said, "That was you. You're a hero, man. Unreal." Darius frowned. His fingers hesitated before tapping open the video link someone had sent. It was shaky, filmed from a phone above the tracks. It caught the entire moment. The old man trapped, the train approaching, Darius running full speed. Leaping onto the track, lifting the chair, the woman helping, the last-second rescue, the platform erupting. There was no narration, no editing. Just raw footage, grainy and frantic. The comments underneath ran wild. "This man deserves a medal. That's the kind of courage you can't teach. Black excellence in action. Where were the others? Help." And then the hashtags. Hashtag Subway Hero. Hashtag Real Courage. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Hashtag Darius Knight. His full name. Darius sat back, his heart suddenly thudding again. Not from danger this time, but from something more disorienting. Exposure. Attention. He hadn't given his name to anyone. Not on purpose, but someone must have recognized him. A former classmate. A nurse from the ER maybe. Someone who overheard when the woman asked if he was okay. It didn't matter now. The story had already taken on a life of its own. He closed the app, locked the phone, and stared across the park lawn. He hadn't done it to go viral. He hadn't done it for praise. He did it because nobody else moved. He thought about his mom, how she'd react to seeing him all over the internet. She'd be proud, of course, but also worried. She always told him, "In this world, son, they'll cheer for you when you bleed, but they don't stay long after the applause." Later that evening, when he finally walked back to his apartment in the Bronx, the hallway felt eerily quiet. He hadn't turned on the TV in years, but when he passed his neighbor's door, Mrs. Alvarez, second floor, he heard his name from inside. She opened the door just as he passed. "Darius," she gasped. "Mijo, I saw you on CHTN too. You scared me. But you saved that man. You were like an angel." He smiled awkwardly, mumbled, "Just did what anyone should do," and kept walking. That night, he didn't sleep. The next morning, his phone rang again. A number he didn't recognize. Chicago area code. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something nudged him. He answered. "Mr. Knight." The voice was older, measured, precise. "This is Dr. Lionel Merrick from the Equitas Health Fellowship Committee. We saw what happened yesterday." Darius sat up straighter. "Sir, About the interview? No need. The man cut in. We understand you missed it for a very good reason. There was a pause. But I'd like to invite you to a meeting with our board later this week. You'll be speaking directly with our donors and trustees. We believe they'd appreciate meeting the kind of candidate we should all be supporting. Darius blinked. Yes, of course, thank you. I appreciate that. We'll send details by email. Dr. Merrick, he said. I believe someone else will be joining us. That caught Darius off guard. Man from the subway? Yes. The voice replied. Dr. Alastair Whitmore. He reached out to us personally. Said it was urgent that he be there. The call ended soon after. Darius stared at the screen, replaying the name in his head. Alastair Whitmore. Why did that sound familiar? He didn't get an answer until 3 days later. The boardroom in the Lakeshore District was nothing like what Darius was used to. Marble floors, tall glass windows, a chandelier that looked like it cost more than his entire student loan debt. He wore the same suit he'd saved up for during his second year of med school. It was slightly tight at the shoulders now, but still clean-pressed. When he stepped inside, a handful of people turned to look. Older men in tailored suits, women with silver hair and polite smiles, and standing at the head of the table, dressed in a brown blazer and khaki slacks, was the man from the subway. No wheelchair, just a cane and a steady stance. Mr. Knight, the man said, extending a hand. It's good to see you again. I'm Dr. Alastair Whitmore. That name now Darius remembered, not just from the subway but from med school textbooks. A former military surgeon renowned for battlefield trauma work, published dozens of papers. Once ran the surgical unit at NATO's Heidelberg Medical Command. Darius shook his hand, more stunned than he let show. I believe you saved my life, Dr. Whitmore said, his voice calm but weighted. And more than that, you reminded me why I joined this profession in the first place. Darius didn't know how to respond, but he didn't need to because, in the next moment, Dr. Whitmore turned to the rest of the room and said, I'd like to personally nominate Mr. Knight for the Courage and Service Grant. Not just for what he did, but for who he clearly is. The room fell quiet, and for the first time since that morning at the station, Darius felt the tension ease. Not because of praise, not because of cameras, but because he realized something far more powerful was happening. He hadn't just saved a man. He'd reignited a legacy. The ceremony wasn't what Darius expected. There were no red carpets, no loud music, no flashing lights. It was held in a modest auditorium at the Chicago Collegiate Hall of Medicine, with maybe 50 people in the room, professors, fellows, healthcare advocates, and a few media cameras in the back corner. The lights were soft, the walls paneled with wood, and a single podium stood center stage. Darius sat in the second row, dressed simply in a charcoal gray suit and a white shirt with no tie. He hadn't spoken much on the ride over, and even now, as polite small talk buzzed around him, he stayed quiet. He didn't feel like he belonged there. At his side sat Dr. Alastair Whitmore, dignified in posture but relaxed in demeanor. The cane rested against his knee. Every so often, he'd lean toward Darius and whisper something funny, usually about how half the room looked like it stepped out of a pharmaceutical ad. Darius smiled politely, but his hands stayed clasped in his lap, fingers intertwined too tightly. A woman stepped up to the microphone. The room quieted. Today, she began, we present the Heart of Service Award, a distinction reserved not for those who seek recognition, but for those who act with courage and compassion when it matters most. Our recipient didn't apply for this award. He didn't ask to be noticed. He didn't even tell anyone what he did. But the world noticed. She turned slightly. Darius Knight, would you join us on stage? Darius rose slowly. The applause started low and polite, then grew. He walked to the podium, shoulders straight but stomach tight. The sound of clapping was both energizing and uncomfortable. He took the stage, accepted the plaque with both hands, and stood behind the microphone. It was quiet again. He cleared his throat. I didn't prepare a speech, he said, voice steady but quiet. Mostly because I wasn't sure I should be standing up here at all. Some in the room chuckled gently. Darius continued, I've always believed that doing the right thing isn't supposed to come with applause. It's supposed to come naturally. That morning at Briarwick Central, I didn't think, I saw someone in danger, and I moved." He paused, looked down at the plaque, then back up. "But I've also thought a lot about what didn't happen that day," he said. "A dozen people closer than I was. None of them moved. Most of them had phones out. Some were afraid. Some just froze. I don't blame them. I just wonder what makes someone step forward when no one else does." He let the question hang for a moment. "My mother raised me to believe that we're responsible for each other. That if we see someone hurting, struggling, or alone, we don't look away. That's not heroism. That's humanity." A quiet murmur of agreement ran through the room. Darius glanced toward Dr. Whitmore. "And I also want to say this. When you save someone's life, you don't expect to see them again. You don't expect them to stand beside you, fight for you, to lift you up." Dr. Whitmore didn't just thank me. He opened a door I didn't know existed. He reminded me that even in a system as big and flawed as ours, there are people who believe in lifting others. Not because it benefits them, but because it's the right thing to do. Dr. Whitmore sat motionless, his face unreadable but his eyes wet. Darius ended simply, "I'm grateful, and I promise to carry this forward. Not by talking about it, but by doing what I've always tried to do. Show up when it counts." He stepped down. The applause came again, louder this time. Cameras clicked, but Darius didn't smile for the camera. He didn't raise the plaque. He just returned to his seat and let the moment pass through him like wind. Fleeting, intangible, but real. Later, as the room emptied and people offered handshakes and congratulations, a young woman approached him. She looked to be in her early 20s, dressed in scrubs with a hospital badge clipped to her waist. "I just wanted to say," she said, voice shaky, "my brother's in a wheelchair, and when I saw the video, it really hit me. You didn't just save one man. You gave people like him a little more dignity. Like maybe someone will show up when it matters." Darius didn't know what to say. He just nodded. For the first time that day, he smiled without force. That evening, back in the Bronx, Darius visited his mother's apartment. It was small but always smelled like cinnamon and lemon, her two favorite cleaning products. She opened the door before he even knocked. "I saw the live stream," she said, pulling him into a hug. "And don't think I didn't notice your hair needed a trim." Darius laughed, tension releasing from his shoulders. He handed her the plaque. "This belongs here more than in my room." She held it gently, her thumb brushing the engraved letters. "It's not the plaque I'm proud of," she said. "It's that you knew what mattered. That's your real reward." They ate dinner at the tiny kitchen table, rice and beans, baked chicken, steamed greens. She talked about neighbors and church gossip. He listened, grateful for the normal. As he prepared to leave, she stopped him at the door. "You're not just good at saving lives," she said softly. "You remind people what it means to care." That night, Darius sat at his desk reviewing anatomy notes, patient case studies, and the scholarship documents now emailed to him. Everything felt the same and yet not. The city hadn't changed. Subway kept moving. People kept scrolling. But for once, just once, the spotlight had found someone not trying to stand in it. And that made all the difference. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.